But please join me in prayer as we start. Gracious God, we thank you for your love and your faithfulness toward us and the whole creation. We know that we often fall short of how you would have us live with one another. And yet we also know that you will forgive us when we acknowledge those failings. Be with us this morning as we talk about how we can be more civil in our personal and our public lives. Open our hearts to your Spirit's leading during our discussion and in the days ahead, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. The last 2 weeks we've talked a lot about some of the characteristics or virtues associated with civility. Patience, integrity or truthfulness, humility, that willingness to believe that, gee, maybe I could be wrong and she's right. And mutual respect of treating each other as God's creature, made in God's image, not being judgmental about them. Last week we talked quite a bit about some of the scriptural foundations for why we as Christians, in a sense, have a particular calling to be civil to one another. We talked about how so much of this is rooted in being grounded in being created in the image of God, and that if we can treat each other by looking for God's presence in that other person, we will almost inevitably treat them civilly. We talked about Christ's commandment that we love one another as I have loved you. And St. Paul reminded us that if we are indeed filled with God's Spirit, those fruits of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness. All things which help contribute to a much more civil society. Have you had any other thoughts during the week that anyone wants to share with us about what we've covered in the past 2 weeks? Seeing no hands, let's go on. We talked about some of the things that contribute to uncivil behavior. This one kind of captures both money and power, or the love of saying. An interesting cartoon when the Pope spoke to Congress. Members of Congress obey the Golden Rule, and they all say amen because of how they understand the Golden Rule. And we also talked a lot about how much in this country we glorify the self, the ego. And I thought this, getting me out there on all these different social media and so on, just kind of captured how egocentric we all are, which makes it very hard in our trying to be civil with each other. So now I have a big question for you. How did you fail to practice civility this week? have that experience? Is anyone brave enough to share that experience?
I yell at my television a lot.
She yells at her television a lot. Well, that's
That's a good one.
a good start, yes. Anyone else brave enough to share something where you caught yourself being uncivil? You're such a wonderful people, so civil to each other. Very good. I want you to take a couple of minutes and read the handout. I hope, does everyone have it? So I think it has some very helpful ideas in it. So let's take about 5 minutes and try and read through it. We have 2 roving mics today, so we're going to try to get mics to you as you want to speak so we can all hear. But several people felt they missed some important statements from each other last week. Professor Davis made some specific suggestions about ways we might be more civil in dealing with others. What do you take away from humanize the other? What does that mean to you? Ruth?
I guess really knowing enough about them and their views to understand them.
Okay. What would give you clues that you maybe made that breakthrough to understand them?
I guess one way would be being able to have a conversation about it rather than the kind of uncivil things we've been talking about. That if you understand each other's views, have a relationship in talking about it, instead of having to walk away from each other because you're so angry with each other, you're sort of, is that what you mean by humanizing? Sorry.
I want to know what you thought. That's good. Who else has some idea on how you go about humanizing another, getting to know them? Diane?
I think you can find common ground on other topics so that you see them as a whole person, not just a person about the one topic.
That's helpful. Anyone else?
I think it's about learning how to know the person. What's he about? What's his background? Find a common ground somewhere.
Okay.
For things other than treating the person as an object.
That brings us back to patience, I think, doesn't it? That if we're going to take time to learn, what's Nick about? I've got to spend some time with him. I've got to, someone else. Jim?
I have found sometimes that my civil dialogues occur with people that I know well, friends or whatever. And if they know me and I know them, then sometimes the problem is we know what each other's flashpoints are. And if our debate or our dialogue or whatever turns incivil, we start hitting those flashpoints.
Okay.
So trying to avoid those, if you know the person well enough that you can know what those flashpoints are and you avoid hitting them, that's a way to keep the dialogue civil and keep each other more human in each other's eyes, I would suggest.
Hold on to the mic. Turn that around. Can you walk in his shoes? Can you walk in the other person's shoes? Can you put yourself in his frame of mind?
I can think of an example. A good friend of mine, Catholic guy, he and I have polar opposite views on abortion, and we've had some dialogues in the past where they become more heated, but the most recent one we had, which at this point is a couple years old, he and I think, just both took the time to speak without letting our emotions get too ratcheted up. And at the end of that, I had a much greater empathy for why this issue was so heartfelt for him. It's like the handout. The example they cited was very similar to my experience. At the end of it, I don't know that I'm convinced it changed my opinion, but I have a much greater empathy for why he held that issue so close to his heart. Did that sort of answer your question,
Okay.
for being able to walk in their shoes? Yeah.
Okay. Someone else have an example of trying to walk in someone else's shoe?
One thing that occurs to me is that there's a tendency to think your position's the right position.
Speak up, please.
Closer to the mic.
Okay, I'll go back to where I started. There's a tendency when you talk to someone and you really have a disagreement over a position or issue, to kind of, as it says in the article, demonize them and see somehow that your argument is good and their argument is evil. And I've always found that the tougher issues are actually good versus good. On the abortion issue, for example, there's good arguments on both sides. You don't need to demonize the other person or see their position as evil. You can see it almost as a battle of good versus good if you can see the fact that both sides have some rational basis to their arguments. So good versus good can be some of the toughest issues as opposed to something you think is good versus evil.
I would agree. In my personal life, I think some of the toughest discussions have been over Israeli-Palestinian rights, where I firmly believe there needs to be a country of Israel and a homeland for the Jews. But my other right is that no one has the right to oppress other people the way the Palestinians are being oppressed. And we have a long-time friend where we actually went 2 years without speaking over that subject. It just got so intense and so hard. Fortunately, we had some communication more recently where it was obvious we were both working very hard to stay civil in the conversation about it. Other thoughts about walking in others' shoes or don't making a demon out of them?
You're talking about the Palestinians and the Jews. I have a very good friend, rather long-time friend, but she doesn't want to hear anything about church. It's zero. And now her husband has Alzheimer's, and she needs a rock. And I've tried to, witness to her or what. She doesn't want to hear. The reason is her husband is a Palestinian, and they've been hurt deeply by what ministers say about the Palestinians. And she said they're not all bad, and she's had a very good marriage, but I'm not saying anything about Palestine and Israel, and I'm not inviting her to any more Bible studies, I'll tell you that. But it's sad. It's sad. She needs a rock now. And,
Good. Anyone in the back there? You've been very quiet those last couple of rows. are some of the, I think we've probably touched on them, but what are healthy strategies to use in conversation? Barbara,
Okay, I think,
wait for the mic.
okay, I think you, all right, I think you could often.
Not on yet.
It has to be green.
Okay. I'll just talk loud.
No, it's not good enough. Please use the mic.
I think if you think hard enough with almost anyone, you can find something that has nothing to do with the disagreements that you have. Okay? So for example, I'm having an issue with someone that I love dearly. And she then wrote me a note and even gave me some flowers. And she said, I'm sorry I said things I did. But I understand because she had a husband who died of Alzheimer's. And she has 2 sons that they live far from here, but they don't ever they don't communicate, they don't come to visit her or anything. So I can understand her hard time. So I wrote her a note and I said, how about, any Sunday afternoon, you know, if you'd like to go to Longwood Gardens and have a little lunch and we can walk around. And I sent her a note, but I haven't heard from her. So should I just close my lips and wait, or should I somehow reach out in another way? Thank you.
That's always a choice point of how often do you reach out to someone. Can you think how some of the scripture we looked at last week relates to any of these? We've mentioned about the need for patience. Where does humility come into?
Thank you. I wasn't here last week, so I don't know the answer to that question, but I was thinking about the previous question, about what are some tactics that you can use to diffuse a situation. And it always seems to me, and I guess a marriage is just like Jim said, it is probably the easiest to hit those buttons. If you want to see him jump, I can do it right now. But you're away. No, I'm not going to do that. One of the things that when I taught school, was that you need to teach people, or we need to teach ourselves, the language that we use can be destructive or constructive. You can say, you know what, this makes me feel however it makes you feel, rather than, you jerk, you're doing, this is what you always, and it just escalates it again. So I think that one of the techniques that we can use are think before you engage the tongue and make those words respectful, all the things be patient, which if you knew me, you know that's very hard for me to do. But it is, I think that our language has to change, and that's something you gotta practice that. If you've been taught as a child to be negative and mean-spirited, then that's probably what's gonna come out when you're upset. So you have to work on changing the way you speak.
And just to add to that, I think sometimes, particularly in higher education, so on, we're taught to be critical, and we hone that skill to such a degree that we forget how to be human and to accept the other side. And
I have a very dear friend that whenever I say anything to her, even if I'm wondering whether she agrees with me or not, she always replies, I understand. And she says that to me no matter, I understand. And I've been contemplating that recently.
how does that feel to you?
It makes me feel that she truly is listening to me. She might disagree, but she understands why I'm saying that. And then the discussion goes from there. She's not argumentative at all, although I know we differ on some subjects. But it calms me down right away. She says, I understand.
Are there other strategies that others of you use to help smooth the?
I think sometimes people are trying to bait you. They're attacking you verbally, and a lot of times looks down and I say, I agree with you. And then the guy looks around like he's startled, you know.
That really undercut his whole argument, didn't it?
People are so critical. I just say to them, well, you have a choice. You have a glass of water half full or half empty.
Yeah,
It's up to you.
Okay. And right back there.
My wife's a member of a pinochle club in our community where 8 ladies get together once a week and play pinochle much of the afternoon. And a few months ago, some of the ladies got into a rather hot political topic, and she was impressed with what the host that day, who's a retired school teacher, she said, very nicely, you know, in our home we don't engage in polarizing conversations, because when the game is over, we'd like to go back to be friends, and so if we could just avoid that topic, we think that would be helpful. So I tried that on my brother, who lives in another state. I was going to be visiting, and for months he's been sending me quite a bit of very hot political ads and destructive ads to the other side. And finally, after this had gone on, in fact, he's done it for years, I finally said in one email, I said, you know, we're going to be home next month, and you know, I haven't been responding to many of these ads because we probably come from a different point on this, Nelson. And I said, if you don't mind, I would appreciate if you would not send me the political information anymore, but I really am interested in family information, pictures of your grandchildren, talking about your work. And when I go home next month, since we're there such a short time, I wish we could avoid that subject so we can all leave with good ties and good friendships and all that. You know. When I went home next month, he came over, a big smile. He said, I didn't know you felt that way. I would have stopped that stuff, you know, a long time ago if you had just told me that.
Oh, very good. Right there's the mic.
Well, I had retired from the nursing profession some time ago, but I work for a retail operation that probably is one of the largest retailers of firearms in the country. I don't sell firearms in the department I'm in, but they're sold in the store. Now, I have my own views on gun control and things like that, but I work in a place where most of the people that come in have definite views. And they express them willingly, but I am an employee, so I cannot engage them in any conversation. I'm restricted from doing that because it would be inappropriate and I'm not doing my job. But when I go into hunters, they're competitive shooters, we do get the person that just wants to arm up with an AR occasionally, but you know, we have a whole variety of people that come in to shop. But the good discourse comes in the break room with the people that sell the firearms specifically in work, and the exchange of views I think is very interesting because it's amazing how civil we all can be sitting in the break room and expressing our opinions. We all have them, but they have their definite views, I have my definite views, and yet, for some reason it works. I don't have a problem working there because I understand people's rights and what they can do, and that's their privilege, and I certainly listen to everything the customer tells me, and I smile when he talks about all that, even if I don't agree with it. But that puts me in a position where I have to be conscious of what I'm saying, and I cannot antagonize, and I can't do anything like that. And yet the good discussion and increased my own understanding of people's viewpoints just by my coworkers in the break room.
Other comments? Go ahead.
I don't know how often you all are looking at social media, but someone in that generation that spends a lot of time looking at it, there are so many that share repeatedly, frequently, their views about political topics, just through the very easy click of the share button. No comment added or perspective given. But you see frequently, over and over and over again, how someone feels about a topic. And in particular, I've had a couple of friends that do that. And then recently, after one of our exercise classes, we all sat down and just sat face to face and talked. And it was just such a lovely conversation of sharing ideas about the pros and cons of both major presidential candidates. And all of us were able to objectively hear what the other person had to say and really hear those strengths and weaknesses from our perceptions. And I think the key to it was the face-to-face interaction, not hiding behind the anonymity of social media, where it's easy to click and send, but you don't have to see a person's facial reaction. So.
Yeah.
Many of my relationships and interactions are with people that I work with, and often we're not face-to-face. It is email. Perhaps some of us pick up the phone a little more often. And because I've been in the relationships with many of these longtime employees for 2 decades, there's a certain amount of knowledge and buttons that we could push, etc. But a little more in? Okay. Sorry, thank you. But all of these steps are something that if I'm dealing with someone where I have baggage, I feel I've been perhaps wrong in the past, didn't want to admit it, there was a right and wrong or a best and less good way of handling something, I try to remember sort of the real basics. This is a child of God. We are here to serve. Let me see how I interact. I look within. And it can bring me back to a very basic of listening, respect, and, that kind of thing. So I wish I could have more face-to-face interactions, but unfortunately they're more distant.
So your comments about social media spurred some thoughts, and I remember listening to a radio show and a woman talking about some suggestions for how to use email, and a lot of times it's all about the speed of communication. Get a response, respond right away, and so on. But that often can lead to maybe typing some things that, if you had more time to reflect, you wish you had not typed them and sent them. So her rule was, like, when she showed up in the office each morning, she'd go through her emails, she'd read them all, the ones that she needed to respond to, she'd type her responses right away, and then save them, in a draft box or whatever. And then she'd come back to them 3 or 4 hours later, like after lunch, and reread them, delete what needed to be deleted, and send the rest. So, in thinking biblically, there are a number of examples in the Gospels where, in the sphere of a lot of controversy or turmoil, you'll see Jesus just sort of step away from the crowd, or maybe lean down and start drawing in the dust, or just take some time to let things happen without responding right away. And it's sort of a different use of the word patience in terms of how you're going to interact with your fellow dialoguers.
Very good. Now, that leads me to another question for you all. What do you do with the person who continues to insist on being very uncivil and rude to you? I heard ignore them. Does anyone else have a better? Jesus wrote in the sand and perpetually uncivil.
It wasn't me.
I'll be happy.
Good, you can say what I was. Well, I'll keep it short. I just had that circumstance with a friend. Once again, the topic, not ice cream, politics. And it's a person that in every other arena, we get along great, except you bring up politics and it's like lightning. It, just sets him off. And if you don't agree with him, it's just, and it's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And I just basically said recently one day, if you'd like to chat about politics and we'll talk about facts and logic and positions, fine. But if you're not going to put a cap on the emotions and stop screaming at me, it's over. We'll never talk about politics again. I mean, I hate it, but what's your other choice?
Yeah.
At some point, hopefully, enough time will go by, we'll say, well, maybe we can find a way. Because in your handout, it says here, seen through the lens of civility, public discourse is not a contest so much as it is a relationship. And like any other relationship, it requires work, and that's a two-way street.
Yeah.
One side is, relationship has to be work on both sides.
And if the other party is not going to enter into the relationship.
And going back to what you said in your chat is, stay away from the emotions. Put a cap on the emotion and talk about the facts, the analysis, and positions. And if yours is 1 + 1 = 3 and mine's 1 + 1 = 0, we'll just agree to disagree. But stop screaming at each other and put a cap. I think sometimes, too quickly when someone disagrees, you immediately go to the emotions, attack them, call them names. It's the old little kid. Wah, 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 wah. I can't believe you can't agree with me and you don't understand me. And throw the tantrum, stamp the feet. And sometimes you just have to try and defuse that by saying, hold on, stop. Can we just talk about the issues here? Why are you getting so upset? Now, sometimes that makes it worse, But, I'm not saying anything, I'm sure none of you have thought or experienced, but it just happened to me last week.
Okay. Yeah, we can give our little kids a timeout, but it's hard to do that with our friends. Okay.
I just want to say one more thing. Years ago, I sold couture wedding dresses, bridal dresses. And frequently, during the course of a bride selecting her gown, the mother of the bride would come, or the groom's mother, or oftentimes there was the stepmother of the bride, or the sister, or whoever would be there. And perceptibly, frequently, there was a tension in the room that I could feel. And I didn't know what the family dynamic was, but frequently that tension would boil to the surface about the dress. And it was never about the dress. It was never about the dress. There was always something going on under the surface, whether it was difficulties in the relationship between the mother and the bride or whoever. It was always not about the dress. And I feel like sometimes it's not about the politics. There's something else under the surface that perhaps, I'm speculating, but perhaps there's something that your friend, is challenged with in the relationship.
Well, you were talking about my mother-in-law.
But I just think sometimes we're quick to hide behind politics when really there's a relationship issue at stake.
Right.
And I think it's in the article, something to the effect of, when saying like, not see the devil where he ain't, and that all Republicans think XYZ and all Democrats think XYZ. I don't think that's ever the case, but I think it's that we're not hearing one another on a human level and engaging personally.
Thank you. I want us to somewhere move on and listen to a little clip from This American Life about a real situation in Boston. So listen carefully and then we'll talk about it.
Which means that he spends a lot of time thinking about disputes between people that seem unresolvable. Peter Coleman,
No picture, sorry.
International Center for Cooperation and Conflict Resolution at Columbia University, which means that he spends a lot of time thinking about disputes between people that seem unresolvable and what can be done in those situations. And he tells this story, he wrote about this in a book too, about the abortion debate in Boston back in the 1990s. Boston's a very Catholic city, of course.
You know, inflammatory rhetoric really on both sides. And then in 1994, there was a shooting. More certain that their point of view on the issue was right, and that the other point of view on the issue from the other side was wrong.
You heard it. What was your reaction to the tag end there that no one changed, that the sides became actually more polarized?
Well, I teach psychology, and actually I was teaching this concept this week, that when you put groups together who are already polarized or already lean a particular way, they're going to start reinforcing each other. And when you try to put the two groups together to talk to each other, it's going to make it worse, not better. You could put individuals together and have a conversation. You can't put two groups of people who are already polarized to bring them together and have them talk. It's just going to make it worse. It's going to reinforce the beliefs.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know. The social psychologists have studied this extensively, and I think that what ends up happening is it becomes part of your identity. I also think that there are certain processes like groupthink that are going on. Group polarization is actually a scientific term that they've studied. Diffusion of responsibility, you know, when it's not just you, if you have some supporters, then you can say more extreme things or take more radical action than you would dare to do by yourself. And I think that's what's happening.
Okay. Other thoughts on why this became more polarized, even though they became respectful of each other and all the good things we've been talking about?
Well, again, you know, I am a social scientist, and one of the things we find, and it goes back to, here's the best example to use is dogs. You can very often deal with a dog that's, you know, not nice and nasty and snarling at you, but put dogs in a pack, and it's very hard to deal with the pack. And the reason is they reinforce
Put the mic closer to his mouth.
they reinforce each other's behavior, and they start feeling in numbers they have strength, and they're more likely to be right. So trying to talk with groups can be very difficult, because the groups will reinforce each other and will actually dig in their positions. And so you don't want that kind of pack behavior. Very often you have to deal with people one-on-one if you want to change behavior positively. And I want to say one other thing. The whole idea about, you know, walking in another person's shoes is really an important concept. It actually comes from an Indian saying, which is, don't judge another person until you've walked a mile in their moccasins. And what that's really saying is you've got to at least temporarily go for the other side. Understand where they're coming from, what values have developed this point of view, why they act the way they do, and so that you can understand it. And by doing that, it diffuses the emotion to some degree, because you can understand why they have that position and why they act they do. The biggest problem is when it scares you to death, and you don't know why the behavior is that way, and what more they might do, like in the case of abortion, and you've got one nut going around shooting people. Well, it can encourage other nuts to run around and kill people. So the thing again is to break that pack mentality.
Other comments?
I guess I have to admit that I was totally surprised that the ending line of that last segment was that they stayed polarized. I thought that by letting their guards down, they would be more receptive to actually transferring sides. But I guess, in a way, this is the point of this whole discussion, is that you're not going to necessarily lose your morals, values, have yourself degraded by opening yourself up to listen and truly listen to what others have to say. It possibly makes us think about the core of ourselves and, you know, and think about why do we feel the way we do, which in a way possibly does strengthen ourselves in our own values and morals, and not that we get washed away by the other person's sentiments. I also just want to say the thing that gets in this handout that you gave, the respectful dialogue distinguishes personal attacks from honest disagreement over the matters and of policies and values. And I think to me that's kind of the core of the whole political mess that we're in right now, is that we have, quote, leaders that cannot distinguish that and respect each other.
It has been a personal conflict, not a policy or issue conflict. I think you're right. Our clock keeps running. Any last comments anyone would like to make? If I can get this to move the right way. There we go.
A very, very short one. I just thought of, in hearing all of this, going back to my friend, I think we should also not forget forgiveness. If he were to ring me up today and say, look, we're friends, let's try and put it behind us, let's go back and hit reset, start talking again, that we also have to get to a place of saying, okay, you don't necessarily have to say it to him that way, but in your mind, I'm going to forgive him. Hopefully he's forgiven me, and let's wipe the slate clean and do it again. So I really think when you hear these conflicts and hardening up, at some point, if you're going to get back to the table, each side's got to forgive and forget the past and give it another go.
Right.
And one of my all-time favorite Plato quotes with the walk in the other person's shoes is the other one of always be kind because everyone's fighting an uphill battle or a hard battle, whichever quote you want to use.
Okay. Very good. One more.
I really like this conclusion here that Dr. Davis makes. Quote, and when enough of us have impressed on our media and our politicians that we are not buying those tactics and will not reward them with our votes, then perhaps politicians and media will cater to what does capture our attention, substantive argument and robust debate. When I read that, I realize that I cannot waste my vote this time on either of the terribly flawed candidates that the major parties have put up. And the only way this is going to end is if we stop voting for these kind of tactics, as he suggests.
Thank you.
We'll change the system.
Yeah.
The third party is as strong as the others.
Okay. I want to thank all of you for this past 3 weeks. It's been a fascinating discussion. I think we've all been made a little more sensitive, perhaps, about watching our tongue. Bible has some good things to say about guarding the tongue too, but we don't look at those. We should. But I'd like us to end again with the prayer of St. Francis, because I think it's so appropriate to what we've been talking about. So join and pray with me. Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace. Where there is hatred, sow love. Where there is injury, where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. Please help me. I'm sorry. There we go. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to understand as not understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, it is dying to self that we are born to eternal life. Amen. Thank you all.